Who does not like to know the future? Seems like sometimes society is very concerned about the future of the world peace. What's Russia going to do? What's the United States going to do? How's the world going to respond? There's a lot of us who like to know the future. Just think if you knew the future, you'd always win the lottery, you know it? You'd always have the winner. Do you believe that we can predict the future? Do you consult those who predict the future in your life? No. Huh?
No.
I bet you do. Huh? What about the weatherman?
Oh, yeah.
You're planning an event for the next week? Who do you look to predict the future for you on that? Weatherman, right?
You're right.
And you hope he's right. You should, you know. We give the weathermen a lot of grief, but you know, most their predictions are pretty good most of the time. We plan our weeks around the prediction of the future by the weatherman sometimes, don't we? What we're going to do in our outside activities. But boy, when he's wrong, you know, he can't predict the future all the time. And when he's wrong, we get pretty upset, don't we? Matter of fact, when we hear we're going to get 10 inches of snow and we only get 1 inch, we get really mad at the weatherman, don't we? Because he was wrong. What about our finances? You ever go to a financial person and you're going to invest some money, and what do you hope your financial man can tell you, or financial woman? What are you looking for when you go to see somebody like that?
A gain in your money.
Huh?
A gain in your money.
Making some more money. Well, you're hoping that they can predict the future. You know, what's my money going to do this year? Should I put money in the stock market? Not put money in the stock market. Where should I? If you got any money, where should you put your money? In the backyard, in your mattress, you know. But we look to people like that we think that can predict what's going to happen with our finances. Especially if you're in the market for a new home, you want to know what the interest rate may be here in the future if you plan on purchasing a home. What about your health? I know every 6 months I go to the doctor and he gives me a report of what my health is, and I'm hoping he can predict the future right. He says, well, I think you might make it another 6 months. So I'm going to count on that. You know, I kind of get a prediction. Some that I know have just had their 1-year exam, and their doctor tells him, looks like you're in good shape for another year. We go to the doctors or to our health professionals, hoping that they can tell us something about our health in the future, right? What should we do in order to ensure our future as far as health goes? What would you like to know about the future?
The Lord coming back.
Okay, when the Lord's coming back. Anybody else? The future is an important event in all of our lives, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And especially when we go to prophecy and things that are happening in the world today. We have a lot of people trying to predict what day Russia's going to go into the Ukraine, or what's going to happen with the world tomorrow, or what's going to happen in different countries, or what's going to happen in the United States. But who can predict the future at 100%? Only God knows 100% of the future that's going to happen before us today. And God didn't keep that to himself. As a matter of fact, he let some of his prophets see a glimpse of the future, especially of those who would dominate the world during their time and their reign on this earth. Each and every one of those leaders were interested in the future. And Daniel was one of the few people who could tell the future events that were going to happen, especially when it came to those who would rule the world rulers as we call them today, and especially that which pertained to the nation of Israel. Now, you know, nothing in this world lasts forever, does it? And we know that in the future that things will be quite different than they are today. And whatever happens today, tomorrow would bring a different day. Could be totally different. You know, at one time they forecasted that man would never break the 4-minute mile as a runner. They said that would never happen. They predicted that nobody could ever break the 4-minute mile of running at. But in 1954, Roger Bannister was the first one to break the unbreakable 4-minute mile. And since then, 500 American runners have done the same thing. See, man has a hard time predicting some of these things that were going to happen. And when man says nothing like that can happen, what happens? It does happen. When we say that this record will never be broken, what happens? Somebody comes along and breaks that record, don't they? Matter of fact, I always heard records were meant to be broken. When we look at today's lesson and we look at Daniel chapter 7 today, and you know volumes were written on Daniel chapter 7 about those leaders who dominated the world at one time or another, about the future, about Bible prophecy, about the end of the age. There have been volumes written about Daniel chapter 7. Who's going to be the next world power? When we think about things in the future, we think about conquerors a lot of times. Who's going to be the next world power? Who's going to be the next strong man? Who's going to be the next world conqueror? Well, the world's only had 4 world conquerors. 3 are already in history, and the 4th is still in history as it's unfolding before us today. But you know, one thing we always want to find out is how the world's going to end, who's going to be the Antichrist, and all these things. But what we ought to be paying attention to is the final world conqueror, and that's Jesus Christ. You know, in the future, Jesus will be the final world conqueror. His rule and reign won't be like man's rule or reign and last just for a certain amount of time. But this 5th and final kingdom of Jesus Christ will last for how long? Forever. It's a concept that he gives us as we look in today's lesson. When we talk about kingdoms of the world, who are the great kings and the great conquerors as we see in society today. Ever since the Gentiles were conquering, we're living in the time of the Gentiles. We've been living in the time of the Gentiles for quite a long time, haven't we? Where they have been ruling and reigning over the earth. Now, around 553 BC, during King Belshazzar of Babylon's first year, Daniel said he had a vision, as we get into the scripture today. And not only did he have a vision, it was a frightening vision. And matter of fact, this vision was first of 4 visions that Daniel's had. And we'll look at this one vision. You know, Daniel's already had a vision that he told Nebuchadnezzar about, didn't he? Remember what it was about? But that great big statue, wasn't it? Daniel's already been able to interpret the future events and the future kingdoms of the world by the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But in this last vision that Daniel had, he was deeply distressed over his vision. And he really wanted to understand it more and more, what it meant to the people of Israel and what it meant to those in the world. And in one of these visions that Daniel's had, he had a vision of 4 beasts representing the 4 kingdoms of the earth. But in the end, God's kingdom would prevail. And as Daniel inquires further about the nature of the 4th beast, which is more frightening than all the rest, Daniel sees this beast as prevailing over God's people for a long time until God would intervene in ending the beast's reign. As we look at Daniel chapter 7 today, we look at about these different kingdoms who ruled and reigned on the earth. Now, as you remember, on that statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, that was a peculiar statue, wasn't it? It had a head of gold, right? Had arms of silver, had sides of brass, had legs of iron, and feet of clay, which represented the four kingdoms that would rule the earth. As a matter of fact, when we look at Daniel's vision, this next vision, as we look at the statue, we look at the outward appearance of that empire. Can you imagine? Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. I mean, what's that tell us? On the outside, it looks like everything was shiny and he had everything going for him, didn't he? You heard about the gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the ancient world. How Babylon had a wall around it that was 300 feet high and 4 chariots could ride across it. That, on appearance, that's a mighty strong city, isn't it? On the outward appearance, it looks like, man, the guy's just doing everything right, don't it? It's called the outward man. We see the things that's on the outside. But as Daniel had this next vision, we know the head of gold and would parallel this vision today as Daniel would call a lion. We know that the arms of silver looked shiny on the outside, but actually was a bear, as Daniel will tell us today about how its characteristics would be. The sides of brass coincides with the leopard. That's, matter of fact, leads us to Alexander the Great. And then the one with the legs of iron and the feet of clay. This is a composite beast, which really has a funny description. We know that would coincide with Rome. As we look at the visions that we see here today, let's pay careful attention to why these are important to those at that time as well as us in the time that we live in today. Let's go to Daniel chapter 7 today. In verse 1 he says, "In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind as he was laying in his bed." Now, what can we say about Daniel? He didn't have just one vision, did he? He didn't get one vision from God. How many visions did Daniel get? He had several visions, the God of revealing him different things about future events, about King Nebuchadnezzar, about these who would rule and reign on the earth down through the future. It said he wrote down the dream, and here is the summary of the account. You know, as we look at these descriptions of the four world empires and that today, Daniel's given great insight to these rulers and their reigns. And it tells us something a little bit about those who rule and reign on the earth. How warlike mankind is, isn't he? You know, there's only been a couple hundred years where we've had a couple hundred years of peace on the earth. But for the most part, what kind of person is man? Man is a warlike creature, isn't he? Huh? Man in his fallen state, we see, is a warlike person. We're always conquering other people. We're always getting our rule in our way. Look what he says here today. In verses 2 to 6, Daniel said, "In my vision at night I was watching, and suddenly the four winds of heaven stirred up the great sea." Now, when we talk about the four winds of heaven, what's Daniel talking about? What type of winds? And when he's talking about the great sea, what's he talking about as far as the sea? Well, what Daniel's saying to us today, when he talks about winds, these are great winds that agitate. These are great winds of agitation, propaganda, public opinion, and disturbance. As a matter of fact, we call them winds of war. You know that? And when we look at the great sea, who's that describing? You ever heard the term, when you looked out, I just saw a sea of people? A wave of people? It was just a sea of people. Well, the Great Sea was a sea of people, the Gentiles at that time. And when he says that the four winds of heaven stirred up the Great Sea, we think of sometimes the winds. How many times do you hear about four winds in a weatherman's forecast? Most of the time you hear the winds coming from the southwest or the south or the north or the east, right? Most of the time the wind blows only in one direction. But what's it say about these winds? These are four winds, all different directions. What's he saying about the people of the world? How they can be blown about each and every way. You know, what we think about might be popular today, tomorrow, it could just change just like that. Because people are very fickle, aren't they? How they can convince people with agitation. We got agitation in our country today, pitting one group of people with the other, you know. The winds that steer the people today politically. What about the winds of propaganda? How much is propaganda used on people today? Do you, my fellow church members today, know what to believe about COVID today? Do we know what to believe about things that go on in our government and in our world today? How much do we write it off as propaganda when we don't know what to believe? Or public opinion. You can stir a public opinion, but is public opinion always right? Great disturbance. How disturbed is the world today? How disturbed are those who live in the world today? You see, the four winds always represent these types of things when we talk about mankind, the great sea of people, we as who are the Gentiles today. But what are some of the things you don't see? We see all these great winds and this agitation, the people. Wars and rumors of wars. But what don't you see? We don't see peace, do we? Mankind as a whole has never lived in total peace. And we don't seek truth here, do we? Remember, was it Paul who described every wind of doctrine? There's different winds of doctrine, how people are so easily to believe any type of wind of doctrine. We can believe about anything if you get the right preacher or mix up the Bible verses in the wrong order. People are greatly agitated. Great disturbance. And out of that, what comes out of that great sea? Look what he says here. Four huge beasts come up from the sea. So where does these four beasts come from? Comes from the people, right? Comes from the different nations. Each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. And I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. Well, what in the world is he talking about here? Who is this lion that had the eagle's wings? Well, most commentators think this is the Great Babylon. And when they talk about wings on a creature like that, what's it say about wings? Swift. How swift was Nebuchadnezzar in conquering the world at that time? And how strong was the lion? As a matter of fact, when we look at these things, and we've already know a little bit from history because we're living way in the future from the things that have happened here today, we see the things that's happened to Nebuchadnezzar. It's written down in history, in secular history today. But he had eagle's wings, a lion. What's that tell us about Nebuchadnezzar? How tough was that kingdom? How tough was that dictator? Or was that king? Huh? He was like a lion. What did he do to other nations? If they didn't comply, he tore them to pieces. You know it? His rule and reign was like a lion. And then it says he was set on his feet like a man. You remember Nebuchadnezzar's life? What happened to him when he thought of himself as great as God or a God? What did God do to him? Well, God humbled him to what? Where he crawled on the ground like a what? Like a beast, didn't he? They crawled for a certain amount of time like a beast until he was given back his human mind. Until he realized, even as the king of the world at that time, there was a greater king than he himself at that time. And then he says, suddenly. And so when he used the word suddenly, we had one kingdom like that. We had, at first we had the Babylonians, we had Nebuchadnezzar. And then he says, suddenly. What's that say? Well, Nebuchadnezzar thought, how long do you think he would rule? Huh? How long did he think his kingdom would last? For a long time. Forever. He thought it would just keep going on and on. But we know through history how it suddenly ended for Belshazzar that night. Suddenly another beast appeared, a second one, that looked like a what? A bear. You ever want to get in a fight with a bear? Everybody ever see that movie, The Remnant? Remember we watched that movie? And you ever see a grizzly bear and some of the ones that they've got, what them claws look like?
Oh yeah.
Huh? 6-inch nails on them things. He was like a bear, and he was raised up on one side. We know that corresponds to that image that was the silver, and raised up on one side because one, the Medes or the Persians, was a little bit stronger than the other. He says he has 3 ribs in his mouth between his teeth. And it was told to get up, gorge yourself on flesh. What's that say about that bear? What's that say about the second kingdom? Huh? Just as ruthless as the first kingdom, wasn't it? You know that this kingdom of the Medes and Persians, I think it was Cyrus at that time, this army moved like a great rumbling bear. They didn't move swift. They took their families along with them. You know that? As they conquered and went along, they took their families. They weren't worried about a quick conqueror, but they were a slow, slumbering, moving bear. They took their families along. And you know the type of army that Xerxes had at one time? He had 300,000 men and 300 ships. That's quite a big army, isn't it? For that time. They were the next world conqueror, the bear, the Medes, and the Persians. Then it says in verse 6, after this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. Keeps using the word suddenly, just one right after another, one right after another. And that's what's happening in the world. It's just one right after another war, isn't it? One right after another. Somebody trying to conquer somebody else in the world. Another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings. Now remember, we said the lion with 2 wings was swift. But how swift was the leopard with 4 wings? Even faster, wasn't it? It had 4 heads and it was given dominion. We looked at the leopard, how it leaps and pounces, and how swift that it was. It talks about Alexander the Great in the Grecians at that time. How old was Alexander when he conquered the world? 33 years old. He died at 33. He already conquered the world. Can you imagine that? 33, I was out playing basketball. I could care less about conquering the world, you know. Alexander conquered the world, the known world at that time. And he died at an age of 33. And it had 4 heads and it was given dominion. After Alexander the Great died, his 4 generals divided the kingdom. You look how accurate we look at the prophecies that Daniel here of the coming kingdoms. Well, these are all in the past. These are not really what we're concerned with. What we're all concerned with, which would impact us today, is this 4th beast. Look what he says here in verse 7 and 8. You know, more attention is given to the 4th beast than all these others combined. We're living in the time of the fourth beast, of the 10 horns and toes, as Revelation and he describes. After this, while I was watching in the night vision, suddenly the fourth beast appeared. Here we have that word suddenly again. One right after another, one right after another. World conquerors, how swift they were. Suddenly a fourth beast appeared, frightening and dreadful, incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and it trampled with its feet whatever was left. And it was different from all the other beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. And while I was considering the horns, suddenly another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. And suddenly in this horn there were eyes like the eyes of a human, and a mouth that was speaking arrogantly. When we look at this fourth beast, so the first one was a lion, the next one was what? A bear. And then the next one was what? A leopard. Very descriptive, you know it, with wings. But what about this fourth beast? It's kind of nondescript. It's not like any other animal you ever saw, is it? Matter of fact, he didn't compare him to any animal, did he? So what did he say about this beast, this nondescript beast? Huh? What's its most notable features of this beast?
Horns.
Huh?
Horns.
Horns? That's a notable feature. What else? What's the other notable feature about this beast? Huh? Dreadful, incredibly strong. With what? Large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured. It trampled. What's that talking about? What type of kingdom is this going to be? Going to be a lot stronger than the other 3, isn't it? We talk about the legs of iron in the statue. Talks about Rome and the Roman rule. The strength of iron. Did you ever hear about the Iron Heel of Rome? They talk about Rome rule over the world was the Iron Heel of Rome. For Rome had its iron heel on the neck of the world for how long? 1,000 years. If you go down through history, you look at the reigns of these other 3 empires, nothing like the Roman reign. It was a 1,000-year reign of Rome. The strength that it had, the hold it had on the world for 1,000 years. And there's no other beast listed as this. But out of this beast, what happened to this beast? What happened to Rome? Was Rome ever really conquered?
No.
What happened to the nation of Rome? It fell apart. Yes, they had invaders. I know about, if you read history, had several invaders. But for the most part, Rome fell apart. More than it was conquered. And many expositors today think it lives on in many of the nations of Israel. And that's what the Bible talks about, the period of 10 horns that Daniel's talking about. The vision of the fourth beast is important to us because it's not really fully been fulfilled. You know that? Yes, Rome with the clay toes has fallen apart. But what about all these different nations that come out of Rome? Are they still around today? As a matter of fact, what the Bible says is that one day, it's important to know that this horns that came back on does not represent a 5th kingdom on earth, but one grown out of the 4th. Everybody's trying to figure out, okay, who's the old Roman Empire? We think it's going to be some of the nations of Europe, 10 nations out of Europe represented by the 10 horns. Do we really know who the 10 nations are today? But yet we're living in that day, you know it. People, I've read so many different books on, we talk about Bible prophecy and who the 10 nations are going to be. But you know, I come to the conclusion that nobody really knows who they are. But I think we're living in that day, according to Daniel today. We're living in that part of the horns. And suddenly, in this horn, this other little horn came up. Matter of fact, 3 of them were uprooted. and this other horn took over, the little horn. Many Bible expositors think that this is nothing but the future talking about the Antichrist. But nobody knows who that is either, do we? We all want to know who he is in the future. We all want to know how the age is going to end. But really, do we know who that is? Daniel's kind of gives us a glimpse of how maybe things are going to go after the rule of Rome. And then later on, down in history, how the 10 horns would come out of the Roman Empire, no rule and reign, and then how the small horn will come out of three of those horns and take over. You see, this is just a short synopsis of the kingdoms of this world. But then we go to what really the important part of this lesson is. The scene shifts to heaven, where the real kingdom is, where the real king reigns. How God will conquer and reign over his kingdom here on the earth. Man's little reign will be over one day. Let's look at verses 9 and 10. And I kept watching. The scene is shifted to heaven. Thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was white as wool. His throne was flaming fire, its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was convened, and the books were opened. When Daniel said here, I kept watching, and as the thrones were set in place, remember the 24 thrones that are set in place around the throne? And who took his seat? The Ancient of Days. Who's that describing? The Almighty God, the eternal God in which we worship. The real throne of God revealed, the eternal God. And what's it say about him? Now describe these other conquerors as bears and leopards and lions and a mighty beast. But what about this conqueror? How is he described here? This is truly going to be the world conqueror one day. His clothing was white like snow. What's that tell us about our eternal God? Huh?
He's pure.
Pure. That's right. He was pure. His holiness and his righteousness. Not only was his clothing like snow, but his hair was like what? The whitest wool. What we think about when we think about people with white hair? Older people. They ought to have a little what? Wisdom. Right? The older you get, you ought to be a little bit wiser than you were when you was a teenager, right? I'm a lot wiser than that. But the wisdom, infinite wisdom, you see. And the throne was flaming fire. How's God going to judge everything? By what? By fire. He's going to go judge our works by fire, remember? To see if it's pure or not. What happens to the wood and stubble? Wood and stubble, what happens to it?
It's burned up.
It's going to get burned up. It's going to be tried by fire. But about the works of gold and silver and the precious things, they'll withstand the fire, won't they? They'll withstand God's judgment. He talks about the fire wheels. He talks about God, the chariot within God, riding the battle, how he exercises authority and his sovereignty. When we talk about the wheels, it talks about God's chariot. And in verse 10, he talks about, when he talks about the flowing, he talks about correct judgments from God. And what is God going to judge? Huh? He said the court was convened. If you got a judge, you're going to have a court, right? Court's being convened, and what happens? Books were opened. What books? Not one book, but what books are open? Huh? Names and deeds of those to be judged. We see this is plural. There are many books. You know, the Bible talks about different judgments. Not just one judgment. There's a great white throne judgment. There's different judgments. You know that? And people can be judged a little bit differently from one another. The person who's never heard the gospel will be judged a little bit differently. But what about the person who's heard the gospel and turned it down? I could be more severe, isn't it, for those who've heard? As God was setting up court to judge, what's happening on the earth at this time? You know, he's switching back and forth from things that are happening in heaven to things that are happening down through history and the world. Verse 11 to 14. And I watched then, because of the sounds of the arrogant words the horn was speaking, talking about the little horn. And as I continued watching, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was removed. But an extension of life was granted to them for a certain period of time. You know, one day when God does come back and judge, you know, Jesus is going to rule the earth. How long? He's going to rule in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. He's going to rule here for 1,000 years. You see? He's still going to be ruling. Who's he going to rule over? He's going to rule over people, isn't he? What type of people who's he going to be ruling over? Those who are left over from the Great Tribulation. The last world conqueror is the Son of Man. The world will be going from human domination to what? Divine denomination, wasn't it? Dominion, I'm sorry. Divine dominion. We'll be having a different system down here when Christ rules and reigns. It'll be a dominion of divinity, of righteousness, of all the things that are right. And I continued watching in the night vision, and suddenly one like the Son of Man was coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days, and was escorted before him. He was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people, nation, and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. You know, there's so much in all these verses and that, and I don't know if I got everything right. You know, I've read so many different commentaries, and so many different people have different opinions about some of these verses. But one thing I do and I get from this is one day the King of Kings and Lord of Lords will come and rule over the earth, and these kingdoms will be gone forever. Mankind's little reign will be over, and we'll have the one who knows how to rule and reign. No matter how you want to interpret the future, no matter who interprets the future, one thing is for sure, is that God will rule and reign over this earth sooner than later, as we think. A lot of people think, where is God? Where is he at? Why is he delaying his coming? And matter of fact, we've got more people in the United States now who claim non-religious affiliation than any time in ever. I think it's 30% now of people in our country claim no religious affiliation at all. Forget what they call that.
Nuns.
Huh?
Nuns.
Is that what they call it?
N-O-N-E.
They're nuns, right? None at all. Nothing at all. You're right. I think that's what it is. The philosophy of man compared to the philosophy of God, quite different. Because God would be a righteous judge. God would judge accordingly to his purposes. And not only that, God would be a merciful judge, a gracious judge, and a gracious king. Verse 11 and 12 constitutes the great tribulation, the end of man's reign on the earth. This will usher in the millennial reign of Christ. He said, and suddenly one like the Son of Man. How many times did Jesus call himself Son of Man in the Gospels? We know who this is. You know, he called himself Son of Man 80, I didn't know that, 80 times. You read him in the Gospels. He refers to himself as Son of Man. Why did he call himself Son of Man? You know, Son of Man is Semitic or Jewish for human being. But what type of human being? When Jesus called himself Son of Man. Is it a frail human being? Is it a simple human being? Or is it the perfect human being? When Jesus calls himself Son of Man and identifies as the human race, he's not identified as a sinner. He's identified as a perfect man. Jesus Christ would be the perfect representation of the human being. Jesus Christ would be the true Messiah. You know, Jewish people believe in the Messiah. You know that? They believe in the Messiah. We believe in the Messiah too, don't we? One difference is we believe he already came. They believe he's still coming. But still, both groups believe in the Messiah, the Son of Man. To the Jews, he was the Messiah. To the Christians, we know him as the name of what? Jesus. Jesus Christ. He was given in dominion and glory in a kingdom so that those, every people, nation, and language could serve who? Now, who the world dictates? Who do they serve? Who mostly are they serving, those who dominate the world today? Are they serving mankind or are they serving themselves? Do you think most of them are serving themselves? I do too. You know, I think about the people in Washington, D.C. Are they serving the American people or are they serving themselves? We got a problem if we think they're serving themselves, don't we? They're supposed to be serving the American people. You do. But Jesus Christ, we'll serve him. We won't serve like we're serving. I think we're the ones servants to those in Washington. We got it backwards, isn't it? The only person we'll ever need to be servants to is Jesus Christ. And that's one thing I think that Daniel makes clear in his prophecy. I don't know what the future holds. You know what? Well, we know what? The one who holds the future. I don't know everything about what's going to happen in biblical prophecy. But I know it will happen one day. And we need to be ready. We need to be living the way God would have us to live, don't we? You know what? It won't be very hard for us. If we already made Jesus Lord and Savior of our lives, it won't matter much if he's ruling in heaven or ruling on the earth, will it? I think that's important for us to see as a church today. It doesn't matter where God is. If we believe in him as Lord and Savior, we'll be serving him here, whether he's up there or down here. Let's think about these things. The future is set, and God knows what it is. I don't know what all is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen to Russia and all these things. I don't know what's going to happen to America. But God knows. So we need to be worried about serving him now and forevermore. Let's think about these things as we go. Brother Jerry, use the word of prayer as we go today.